Jare gelede is die San verskriklik benadeel deur navorsers, mediapersone en ons kan dit maar noem, klomp mense. Dat het die San verskriklik bang gemaak en ons het nie raad gehad hoe om dit te bekamp nie, dit bymekaar te kry nie en iets kry waarop ons kan werk nie.
They are not some exhibit in a living museum, so why are people living in Indigenous communities treated like that? Hi, I'm Femi Oke.
I'm Malika Bilal. In part 2 of our Indigenous Views series, we ask, is there an ethical way to research Indigenous communities? Tweet us your thoughts or leave them in the live YouTube chat, and you too could be in the stream.
My name is Jacqueline Keeler, and I am a Diné and Dakota journalist, and you are in the stream.
For many years, Indigenous communities around the world have been bombarded with scientists seeking to learn from man's earliest ancestors.
But now those communities are pushing back. 3 groups of San people in South Africa have established guidelines for researchers. The San Code of Research Ethics outlines how they expect to be treated. Similar rules have been developed by other Indigenous people in North America and Australia.
Here to discuss this from Johannesburg, South Africa, we have Anthony Philip Williams. He's the Executive Chairman of the Indigenous First Nation Advocacy Group in South Africa. In Canberra, Australia, Tom Kama. He's an Indigenous social justice and human rights advocate. And in Toronto, Canada, Julie Ball. She's an Inuk researcher. Hello, everybody. It's so good to have you here. Let's start with some headlines. The stories you could tell, I'm sure. Grand Chief horrified that Alberta quietly allows organ harvesting from children who die in provincial care. Canada's shameful history of nutrition research on residential school children. Let me see one more here. Indigenous DNA at Centre of Ethical Furore could help reconnect stolen generations, which makes me think ideas and practices like that led to the San people of South Africa giving out a code of ethics for researchers. But, Anthony, it's not just you, it's Indigenous groups around the world. But can you give us one story that leads to Indigenous communities saying, okay, guys, you need to have some kind of protocol with how you work with us. We're not here for your private use. Give us one story that illustrates that perfectly, Anthony.
No, absolutely. I think one of the very serious concerns that we have developed, I personally have taken a number of researchers and those in the media space, in particular to the places like the Kalahari Desert, where the Bushman people are still located. And what we have experienced, we continue to experience what I personally want to call educational dominance as one of those very unpleasant, experiences where somebody who's an educationist or someone who's who's got some doctorate or some degrees, who comes down to the community at local level and then dominate them, and intimidate them basically with their knowledge, to the extent that they not only dominate, but they also materially dominate them. They come at times and they misuse the people. So they've got a little bit of money, and what they normally do is they would violate the local leadership, and they would just access the local community without proper protocols. And these are some of the things that we thought we need to relook. And therefore, I think in particular, this was the thinking of the SAN, the SAN Institute, and also this is also our approach here as a community, that we cannot allow for people just to come with a personal bias and just walk away with the prize.
Julie, who would do that? It seems so rude.
Yeah, a lot of people say that to me, but it's not just ancient history that we can look to now. I have examples of just this year in 2018, 2017, of researchers who maybe they don't know or maybe they do know, and they try to skirt what the protocols may be. One of the biggest challenges we find here in Canada, and I'm presumably around the world, is that often the ethics protocols that exist within researchers' institutions is based on individual protections in research. And when we're working with Indigenous people, there is an additional layer of approval and consent that needs to happen at the community or collective level. And so often the exploitation can happen when people don't do that part and just, for whatever reason, find people in the community who will participate. And, you know, we often talk about vulnerability, but Indigenous people are only vulnerable in relation to the people who have been making us vulnerable in research. We are not inherently vulnerable. And yet a lot of the protections that are put in place at institutional levels are done in such a way that it sounds as if Indigenous people cannot make up their own minds or consent to the research themselves, and that institutions are there to do that for us, when in fact we know that we are able and capable to make those decisions for ourselves, which is why many Indigenous communities in Canada and around the world are creating their own codes of ethics and are simply saying no to researchers who don't adhere to those protocols.
Well, Julie, I hear what you're saying there. I want to share another example with you all and our audience. This is from Pam on Twitter. And Julie, you actually saw this tweet just a few seconds ago and favorited it. So Pam writes, schools, universities, and some media historicize us. We once lived this way. We once did these things. Instead of featuring us as we are now, the good, the inspirational, the challenges, we are still here. She goes on to say that some media in particular, but I will broaden this out to say this could also go for researchers, need to break out of their own discriminatory views they don't know that they have, like interviewing Indigenous women on violence against women and child poverty, but saving all of the political, business, and legal commentary for white men. So there's just one example she gives there. Tom, I'm going to pivot and give this one over to you. This is just one example that Pam here on Twitter has brought up. What comes to mind for you?
Oh, look, I think one of the big discourses that's happening across Australia at the moment, the conversations, is about unconscious bias. And, you know, we all have it, and it's those biases or the attitudes and behaviours that we developed and what we've learnt in the past. I think one of the big areas for us of concern has been that when you look at research ethics, it's always been developed by the dominant society, the non-Indigenous people, and it comes from their perspective and what they want to gain out of it. We've now turned that around in Australia and developed up some Indigenous research ethics that are going to apply not only to the major funding bodies, the health research funding bodies and the Australian Research Council, but it'll apply to universities as well, so they'll have to look at adopting it. And this is only released, you know, a couple of weeks ago, and you know, it's out calling out now for major comment to come back. But you know, what's important to look at is that it's not only the here and now today that we've got to be concerned about, but it is to look into the future and try and future-proof some of our activities, because we're still trying to address the legacy of the past and the research, as you mentioned earlier, that's been undertaken. In Australia, we've had a very long history of removal of body parts and use and spread around the world under the name of research, and many of those remains are now being returned to us. And so it's how do we protect that? How do we ensure that those sort of practices don't happen into the future? And
Tom, there are going to be a couple of people listening who will just be saying, hold on a minute, removal of body parts and spread around the world, what kind of research is that? Can you just briefly explain what you mean by that? And then Anthony's saying exactly. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, it was, you know, there was a big discussion, it's worldwide actually, where people of colour were always seen to have a lesser intellect, and so they had to measure the brain and so forth, and so we've seen, you know, whole heads being taken away, you know, places, there's you know, under the study, and what's interesting is that there's still researchers now wanting to get access to some of those remains that are in museums around the world, in research centres, and still do research on them. And some of that research may be valid, but it's got to be done with the full knowledge and consent and engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Anthony,
so, you know, that's what...
Anthony, this obviously resonates with you. Go ahead.
No, no, absolutely. I think this is a very critical example. South Africa has got a very clear cut example to this. Everybody the world over knows the story about Sarah Baartman and how she has been, been made the a world. The French made her some serious studies about a body parts, buttocks, etc. And there's a issue right now, in particular for us as the indigenous people of South Africa. We have been told that the remains of Sarah Baartman has returned back to South Africa, and what many people don't know is that the remains of Sarah Baartman is still in a museum right down in France. And these are some of the very difficult issues that has not been addressed. And what Tom is correctly alluding to,
It's
that
still with us. This history of abusive
exactly
research is
people
still
of
with
color.
us.
Yes,
Yeah.
people of color is always made out to be of lesser intelligence.
And also that, if you want to Google it, everybody, after the show, the character, the person that Anthony's talking about is a beautiful African lady who has extremely impressive proportions, and she was studied as an exhibit. And so go look at that, but not quite yet. Have a look here on my computer. There is an organisation right now who's trying to partner is the word, with Indigenous communities, trying to work with them to say, we are working with you, we're not just going to research you. And they put a film together pulling up some of the really important issues that come with researching very badly. So I want you to meet Andreas. Andreas explains what it is like to do research the old-fashioned way, what it feels like. Have a look.
'n mens iets goeds wil hê, moet jy jou huis baie goed opsom. Jou huis moet 'n deur hê sodat niemand by die venster kan inkom nie. Jy moet deur die deur kom by die leierskap. Ons vra nie geld nie, glad nie. Dit het nog nie by ons gebeur dat die leierskap geld vra vir navorsing nie.
So researchers, according to Andreas, are coming in through the window very sneakily, and they should be knocking at the front door and saying, is it okay if I come in? I love that visual. Julie, you do workshops for researchers to help them understand. I'm just going to show people a tweet here so they understand what you do. Best practices. How do you research well? How do you do this with respect? What's the number one lesson that you teach people?
Well, I think as the screen just showed there in the title, that research is reflexive and relational, and that really is the two biggest lessons. First of all, you need to ask yourself why you're doing it. If we are non-Indigenous people doing this work, why are we doing it? Is it simply to perpetuate racist or discriminatory ways of understanding Indigenous people? Is it solely for our own academic careers or our professional careers? What is the benefit to the community? And as was just shown in that video, certainly having that relationship with the community, communities are not saying that they don't want research. We just want ethical research and not those ones with the helicopter researchers who fly in and take from us. And to kind of pick up on what the others were saying, it's not only about biological samples and human remains. There's lots of ways in which Indigenous people are exploited in research, even if it could be simply through interviewing people. We're collecting so much, extracting knowledge and resources from communities without giving back to them or having any benefit to them. A joke often in our communities is that, you have a mom and a dad and a couple of kids and an anthropologist because, everybody is just so used to being studied all of the time.
So here is one other tip from someone on Twitter. She writes, research should be a dialogue, not an intrusion. And she goes on to say, I think some researchers might approach an Indigenous community as a commodity with regards to their work. What value can this community add to my work, being the driving thought process, not how can we work together to do something valuable? So Anthony, she turned it on its head, but have you seen people come and look at it the opposite way, asking what value can the San community add to my work, and what do you do in that instance?
Well, some of the things that we've been struggling with to understand, when people come to do research in our communities, it's got to do with very few people want to try and understand the local context, try and appreciate the local context and execute their research, in a context of justice, of fairness, of equity, and also of preservation. These are some of the things that we find that's missing. When researchers, in particular, we just recently had a team of American guys that I took around, and there's always this sense of when they come here, they want to get maximum, they want to extract maximum, in the indigenous knowledge system, but they are not prepared, to return, or to have it as a mutual beneficial relationship. And these are some of the absolute difficulties that we are currently that we're struggling with. And so we're trying to get these guys to understand that when you engage the community, that these are elements within ethical, ethical codes of conduct, that you ensure that you make them part of what you're extracting from the community.
Tom, I'm going to show our audience something that you've been working on. It's right here on my laptop. It is the National Health and Medical Research Council. I'm just going to scroll down here a little bit. It's quite some document. Ethical conduct in research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. Guidelines for researchers and stakeholders. And I looked through, and this really leapt out at me. The 6 core values. How do you, as an Indigenous community, say, this is what we need from you? Did you argue? Did you debate? How did you come up with spirit and integrity right there in the centre? And then we've got cultural continuity, equity, respect, reciprocity. That's what Anthony was just talking about, and responsibility there as well. How do you decide that is what you want from outsiders coming into your community?
This is what we've heard. In Australia, there's only been really two big works looking at ethics, research ethics from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective, and one was done by the Australian Institute of Studies, and the other by a group called Ninety One, which works with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at a community level, and they're a not-for-profit company. I happen to chair it, but we've done this about 10 years ago. We've done that research working with people, and the new research that we've done through that you just mentioned really does get its core values from the work that's been done by others. But the majority of people on the team that developed up these guidelines were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from across Australia, and so many of us had first-hand experience. And it's what we've picked up over the years in working with people from communities. But I think there's a couple of really important things to share with our listeners. And one is that when we talk about research, it's not just done by academics and professional people. It's done by bureaucrats who want to go out and find out more from a community. It's done by corporates who might want to get access to farmer products in in communities, and it's just some of this unscrupulous behaviour where somebody who is in a positional power goes out and befriends an Aboriginal person, has a conversation, and our people are very generous. We'll talk to people, and then we find out that person's taken one of our stories or found out about a plant that we might use for medicinal purposes, and before you know it, it's suddenly being commercialised, and we don't get any value out of it. We get mining companies going out to befriend Aboriginal people so they can get access to our resources. So it's and I don't want to leave people with the impression that we're only talking about academics, because we're not. And the other really big debate that we have to look at is data sovereignty. All the information that's being collected, how do we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people retain ownership of that and make sure that what we picked up, that data is not misused and misinterpreted and gives a negative picture or a stereotypical picture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And when we look at Australia, we're a very, very diverse country, and there's 300-400 tribes around Australia,
right,
and numerous language groups, and so we can't just see it as a pan-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander homogenous viewpoint. We've got to work with the communities and those discrete communities and their cultural practices.
Of course.
And that's why cultural integrity
Tom,
is
you brought up
important.
so many important points just in that, and that I want to pick apart a couple of them. So one of them, you said this is not just academics. I'm glad you said that, because someone on YouTube is thinking the same thing. This is someone from Bangladesh, and they write, for example, we've been using activated charcoal to clean our teeth for generations. The British said we were dirty and backwards. Now, ironically, it has become a trend in the West. So, and of course, it's also being commercialized. So that's one person hearing what you're saying there. But I wanted to turn to this, because what you said also raised this question. Jared here tweets, a code of ethics is only as good as the people who are charged with implementing it. Now, if you promise to consult with, say, First Nations regarding pipelines, oil extraction, and then you don't, then the ethical guidelines have no merit. So that begs the question, Julie, coming from YouTube, how can we ensure that the participants in any research profit from the research equal to that of the researcher? It's a hard question, Julie.
It sure is a hard question, and I think that it's one that we're still struggling with, because there is no ethics police. So despite our best efforts to have policies and protocols and processes in place, it's really hard for communities, and even in academia for that matter, for people to be able to actually police what happens. We can often say what we're going to do, what we plan to do, what we propose to do, but then there's nobody that's kind of holding us to account for that. One thing that is happening slowly but surely is community members themselves and community agencies recognize their right to say no. And so the more that happens, the less likely it is for those researchers to be able to get in through the window rather than knocking at the front door and asking for permission. Because until now, it's been the case that people in communities often think that they have to say yes when researchers come in, because they may be physicians or whatever other profession they may be. So they feel like people in communities think that they had to say yes to those people. But slowly and surely, we're starting to see community members and nations and governments in Indigenous communities saying no. And I think that that's a big step forward in mitigating some of these challenges.
Guess I have to play this for you, and this is Jan, and it's from the Trust Project Global Research documentary that they put together. It's the case for ethics for Indigenous communities. And Jan is talking about researchers coming in, taking their knowledge, going away, and then them not seeing anything coming back from it. Have a listen to how he puts it.
Schooltjies het baie van hulle diep deurdrongende inheemse kennisse van gebruik gemaak om baie medisynes aan tafel te lê tot oorlewing van mense. Verskillende plaat ingewelm en ons moet kennisse bymekaar gooi om al daardie siektes te dood. Terwyl my grootvoorvaders in armoede gesterf het, terwyl hulle sulke groot kennisse vir die aarde neergelê het, moet dit maar ewig so gaan.
Anthony, that is so painful to even listen to. I'm wondering, I'm not Indigenous, so I don't understand. What is it like to be studied, to be researched, to be photographed? What is that experience like?
Well, it's absolutely, at times it is overwhelming, in particular for our community, because what we must realize is that quite a number of our people in the rural areas in particular has had very little contact with what one could probably call your broader civilization. And therefore, when you have this kind of researchers, whether they're from academia or they come from the media space, or including those guys within in corporates, sure. Within corporates, there's always this a sense of inferiority that our people feel, and that's what I was talking about earlier on, this dominance, educational dominance, material dominance. But something that I want to add on to
Anthony, we are right at the end of the show, so I'm just going to say thank you.
Yes.
I'm going to say thank you so much because we're right at the end of the show. I want to say thank you to Tom and to Julie and to Anthony as well for joining us. I'm actually going to leave you with a little clip of good practices for studying Indigenous communities. This is a competition that was held for the San people. This is the San Code of Research Ethics in RAP. We are the San. Have a listen. Thanks, guests.